Palace Thief, Section 4. Back at St. Benedict's, furthermore, I saw that my words had evidently had some effect on the boy, for in the weeks that followed he continued on his struggling uphill course. He passed 2 more quizzes, receiving an A- on one of them. And for his midterm project, he produced an adequate papier-mâché rendering of Hadrian's Gate, and in class he was less disruptive to the group of do-nothings among whom he sat, if indeed he was not, in fact, attentive. Such, of course, are the honeyed morsels of a teacher's existence, those students who come under one's own direction from darkness into the light. And I admit that I might have taken a special interest that term in Cedric Bell, if I gave him the benefit of the doubt on his quizzes when he straddled 2 grades, if I began to call on him in class only for those questions I had reason to believe he could answer, then I was merely trying to encourage the nascent curiosity of a boy who, to all appearances, was struggling gamely from beneath the formidable umbra of his father. The fall term was by then drawing to a close, and the boys had begun the frenzy of preliminary quizzes for the annual Mr. Julius Caesar competition. Here again, I suppose, I was in my own way rooting for Cedric. Mr. Julius Caesar is a St. Benedict's tradition, held in reverence among the boys, the kind of mythic ritual that is the currency of a school like ours. It is a contest held in 2 phases. The first is a narrowing maneuver by means of a dozen written quizzes from which 3 boys from the first form emerge victorious. The second is a public tournament in which these 3 take the stage before the assembled student body and answer questions about ancient Rome until one alone emerges triumphant, as had Caesar himself from among Crassus and Pompey. Parents and graduates fill out the audience. In front of Mr. Woodbridge's office, a plaque attests to the Mr. Julius Caesars of the previous half-century, a list that begins with John F. Dulles in 1901. And although the ritual might seem quaint to those who have not attended St. Benedict's, I can only say that in a school like ours, one cannot overstate the importance of a public joust. That year, I had 3 obvious contenders. Fred Masaldi, who, as I intimated, was a somewhat gifted boy, Martin Blythe, a studious type, and Deepak Mehta, the son of a Bombay mathematician who was dreadfully quiet but clearly my best student. It was Deepak, in fact, who on his own and entirely separate from the class had studied the disparate peoples from the Carthaginians to the Egyptians whom the Romans had conquered. And by the end of the narrowing quizzes, however, a surprising configuration had emerged. Cedric Bell had pulled himself to within a few points of 3rd place in my class. And this was when I made my first mistake. Although I should have certainly known better, I was impressed enough by his efforts that I broke one of the cardinal rules of teaching. I gave him an A on a quiz on which he had earned only a B. And in so doing, I leapfrogged him over Martin Blythe. And on the 15th of March, when the 3 finalists took their seats on stage in front of the assembled population of the school, Cedric Bell was among them, and his father was among the audience. The 3 boys had donned their togas for the event and were arranged around the dais, on which a pewter platter held the green silk garland at the end of the morning I would place upon the brow of the winner. And as the interrogator, I stood front row, center, next to Mr. Woodbridge. Which language was spoken by the Siboneyes? Osan, replied Fred Masaldi without hesitation. Who composed the second triumvirate? Mark Antony, Octavian, and Marcus Aemilius Lepidus. Sir, answered Deepak Mehta. Who was routed at Philippi? Cedric Bell's eyes showed no recognition. He lowered his head in his hands as though pushing himself to the limit of his intellect, and in the front row my heart dropped. Several boys in the audience began to twitter. Cedric's leg began to shake inside his toga, and when he looked up again, I felt that it was I who had put him in this untenable position, I who had brought a tender bud too soon into the heat, and I wondered if he would ever forgive me. But then, without warning, he smiled slightly, folded his hands, and said, Brutus and Cassius. Good, I said instinctively. Then I gathered my poise. Who deposed Romulus Augustulus, the last emperor of the Western Empire? Odoacer, Fred Massaudi answered, and then added, in 476 AD. Who introduced the professional army to Rome? Gaius Marius, sir, answered Deepak Mehta, then himself added, in 104 BC. And when I asked Cedric his next question, who was the leading Carthaginian general of the Second Punic War, I felt some unease, because the boys in the audience seemed to sense that I was favoring him with an easier examination. Nonetheless, his head sank into his hands, and he appeared once again to be straining the limits of his memory before he looked up and produced the obvious answer. Hannibal. I was delighted. Not only was he proving my gamble worthwhile, but he was showing the twittering boys in the audience that under fire, discipline produces accurate thought. And by now they had quieted, and I had the sudden heartening premonition that Cedric Bell was going to surprise us after all, that his tortoise-like deliberation would win by him, by morning's end, the garland of laurel. The next several rounds of questions produced much in the same manner as had the previous two. Deepak Mehta and Fred Massaudi answered without hesitation, and Cedric Bell did so only after a tedious and deliberate period of thought. What I realized, in fact, was that his style made for excellent theater. The parents, I could see, were impressed, and Mr. Woodbridge, next to me, no doubt thinking about the next annual fund drive, was smiling proudly.